Symbolism and the human brain. What if I told you that your brain doesn't just process symbols? It literally cannot think without them. And every abstract concept you've ever understood exists only because of a biological mechanism that transforms physical patterns into meaning. Your brain evolved to survive in physical environments, not to contemplate justice, love, or democracy. Yet you effortlessly grasp these abstract concepts through symbolic thinking, a cognitive capacity that neuroscientists call humanity's most significant evolutionary advantage. Symbols aren't decorative, they're how your brain makes the invisible visible. This isn't literary analysis nonsense. This is hard science. Researchers admit, the Max Planck Institute and UC Berkeley have documented exactly how your brain processes symbols. When you encounter a symbol, a flag, a cross, a corporate logo, or even a word, multiple neural networks activate simultaneously: visual processing, emotional centers, memory systems, and conceptual networks all fire in coordinated patterns that create meaning from marks on a surface. Ancient wisdom traditions understood symbols' power intuitively. From cave paintings to religious iconography to alchemical diagrams, humans have always known that certain images carry meaning beyond their physical form. Modern neuroscience reveals why. Symbols exploit your brain's pattern recognition systems to encode complex information in compact, memorable forms. A symbol is a cognitive shortcut neural compression algorithm that lets your brain store vast meaning in minimal space. Your thoughts are made of symbols. Your identity is constructed from symbols. Your reality is mediated through symbolic representation. I'm about to expose 10 mechanisms through which symbols literally shape your brain, perception, and behavior. Each technique reveals how symbolic processing works at the neural level, and how you can harness this understanding to think more clearly, communicate more effectively, and recognize when symbols are being used to manipulate you. Your brain runs on symbols. Time to understand the code. Part 1. The conceptual metaphor foundation. You think you understand abstract concepts directly. You don't. Every abstract idea in your mind is built from metaphors grounded in physical experience. Cognitive linguist George Lakoff's research proves that abstract thinking depends on conceptual metaphors, understanding love as warmth, time as space, and ideas as objects we can grasp. Your brain literally cannot process abstraction without mapping it onto physical experience. This is technique number 1 out of 10, the conceptual metaphor foundation. For 30 consecutive days, analyze the metaphors underlying your thinking. When you use abstract concepts: success, relationship, idea, progress, write down the physical metaphor. Success is up, climbing ladder. Failure is down, hitting bottom. Document 10 conceptual metaphors daily. Notice how every abstraction translates to spatial, physical, or sensory domains. Track which metaphors you use most frequently. Your brain's abstract reasoning circuits are built on top of sensorimotor systems. You understand grasping an idea because the same neural regions process physical grasping and conceptual understanding. Symbols work because they anchor abstract meaning to concrete sensory patterns. You're making explicit the hidden metaphorical structure underlying all abstract thought. Research shows that people's bodies unconsciously respond to metaphors. Reading about rough surfaces activates touch processing regions, proving metaphors aren't linguistic, they're embodied. Start mapping conceptual metaphors and watch abstract thinking reveal itself as systematically grounded in physical experience through symbolic mapping. Part 2. The emotional contagion. Encoding symbols don't just carry meaning, they carry emotional charges that your brain processes automatically, bypassing conscious evaluation. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research on somatic markers shows that symbols trigger emotional responses before conscious recognition. Your amygdala responds to flags, religious symbols, or brand logos within 100 milliseconds faster than conscious awareness. This is technique number 2 out of 10, the emotional contagion encoding. Identify 20 symbols that trigger strong emotional responses in you: flags, logos, religious icons, political symbols. For each, spend 5 minutes documenting what emotion arises. Where do you feel it physically? What memories associate with it? Practice this symbolic emotional mapping for 40 consecutive days. Notice that the emotional response precedes and often contradicts your rational evaluation. Symbols become emotionally charged through repeated pairing with experiences. Your brain's association circuits link the visual pattern with emotional states. The symbol becomes a trigger that automatically activates those states. You're recognizing that symbols hijack your emotional system before your reasoning system engages. Studies on implicit bias show that symbolic associations operate unconsciously. You can consciously reject a symbol's meaning, while it still influences your automatic responses. Start mapping symbolic emotional triggers and watch awareness emerge about how symbols manipulate feelings beneath conscious control. Part 3. The identity construction matrix. Your sense of self is built from symbols, national flags, religious icons, brand affiliations, and group markers that your brain uses to construct identity. Social psychologist Henry Totfel's research on social identity theory proves that symbolic group markers activate in-group, out-group processing automatically. Your brain uses symbols to answer "Who am I?" by determining "Who are my people?" This is technique number 3 out of 10, the identity construction matrix. List every symbol you identify with: national, religious, political, brand, subcultural. For 50 consecutive days, notice when these symbols appear and how they affect your sense of self. When you see your symbol, how do you feel? When you see opposing symbols, what shifts? Document instances where symbolic identity overrides rational evaluation. Defending your symbols regardless of logic. Your brain's self-concept networks integrate symbolic affiliations into identity. Symbols become proxies for self-attacking. Your symbol feels like attacking you. This mechanism evolved for tribal cohesion, but now operates with arbitrary modern symbols. You're recognizing how symbols hijack identity formation. Research shows that threats to symbolic identity, flag burning, logo mockery, activate the same brain regions as physical threats. Symbols become self. Start observing symbolic identity construction and watch yourself. Recognize how arbitrary markers become core to who you are. Part 4. The compression algorithm. Function symbols are cognitive compression. They package vast meaning into minimal form, allowing your brain to think efficiently about complexity. Computer scientist Herbert Simon's work on bounded rationality shows that human cognition relies on chunking, compressing information into manageable units. Symbols are the ultimate chunks. Entire worldviews compressed into single images. This is technique number 4 out of 10. The compression algorithm. Function: choose 10 complex concepts you work with: democracy, justice, sustainability, innovation. For each, identify the symbols that represent them: scales for justice, light bulbs for ideas. Spend 60 days analyzing what information does the symbol compress, what gets included, what gets left out. Create alternative symbols for the same concepts. Notice how different symbols emphasize different aspects. Your brain can't hold complexity in working memory simultaneously. Symbols solve this by compressing. You think justice, and the symbol activates an entire conceptual network without requiring conscious processing of every element. You're recognizing that symbols aren't just representations, they're cognitive tools that enable thinking about complexity. Studies on expertise show that experts develop elaborate symbolic systems. Chess masters see patterns, symbols, not individual pieces. Compression enables mastery. Start analyzing symbolic compression and watch yourself. Recognize how symbols enable thinking about complexity by encoding it efficiently. Part 5. The pattern recognition hijack. Your brain evolved extraordinary pattern recognition, seeing faces in clouds, meaning in randomness. Symbols exploit this capacity to make you see meaning that isn't inherently there. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga's research on the interpreter module shows that your left hemisphere constantly generates meaning from patterns. It will find significance in random data. Pareidolia, apophenia, and pattern seeking are features, not bugs. This is technique number 5 out of 10, the pattern recognition hijack. For 45 consecutive days, practice distinguishing inherent meaning from projected meaning in symbols. When you encounter a symbol, ask, what meaning is actually in this image, versus what meaning am I adding to it? Look at unfamiliar cultural symbols. Notice they're just shapes until you learn their assigned meaning. Document 15 instances where you catch yourself projecting significance onto neutral patterns. Symbols work by exploiting your brain's pattern completion systems. You see partial pattern. Your brain automatically completes it with meaning drawn from memory and culture. The symbol itself contains no inherent meaning. It's a trigger that activates meaning networks you've built. You're distinguishing the symbol from your response to it. Research on religious experiences shows that meaning perception activates whether the stimulus has inherent meaning or not your brain generates meaning. Regardless, start distinguishing projection from perception and watch symbols reveal themselves as triggers for your meaning making, not containers of meaning. Part 6. The cross-cultural translation barrier assumes symbols mean the same thing to everyone. They don't. The same image activates completely different neural networks in brains shaped by different cultures. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz's work on symbolic systems shows that meaning is culturally construct. And a gesture that means peace in one culture means insult in another. Your brain's symbolic processing reflects your cultural training, not universal truth. This is technique number 6 out of 10, the cross-cultural translation barrier. Research 20 symbols that have different meanings across cultures, colors, hand gestures, animals, numbers. Spend 70 consecutive days documenting. How does your culture interpret this symbol? How do other cultures interpret it? Notice your automatic assumption that your interpretation is correct or natural. Practice recognizing symbolic meaning as learned convention, not inherent property. Cultural exposure during development shapes which neural associations form around symbols. The same visual input activates different networks depending on cultural context stored in memory. You're recognizing that symbolic meaning isn't universal, it's culturally programmed into your neural networks during development. Studies on bicultural individuals show that different cultural contexts activate different symbolic associations in the same brain. Meaning is context dependent. Start exploring cross-cultural symbolic variation and watch your assumptions about natural meaning dissolve as you recognize cultural programming. Part 7. The narrative framework activation symbols don't exist in isolation. They activate entire narrative structure stored in your memory. One symbol triggers a whole story. Psychologist Jerome Bruner's research on narrative thinking shows that humans organize experience through stories. Symbols serve as narrative anchors. A single image activates an entire mythological or historical narrative structure. This is technique number 7 out of 10, the narrative framework activation. Identify 15 symbols connected to larger narratives. National flags, national story, religious symbol, spiritual narrative, historical monuments, historical story. For 60 consecutive days, when encountering these symbols, explicitly articulate the full narrative they activate. This flag triggers the story of. This cross activates the narrative of. Notice how much narrative your brain automatically loads from minimal visual input. Symbols are narrative compression. They're chapter markers that reference entire story structures. Stored in long-term memory, your brain doesn't just see the symbol. It activates the associated narrative network. You're making explicit the hidden narratives that symbols implicitly reference. Research on cultural memory shows that symbols maintain collective narratives. Across generations, the symbol preserves and transmits story. Start identifying narrative activations and watch symbols reveal themselves as anchors for vast story structures your brain automatically accesses. Part 8. The manipulation vulnerability point. Because symbols bypass rational processing and trigger automatic emotional and identity responses. They're the primary tool for manipulation. Advertising, propaganda, and persuasion all exploit symbolic processing. Psychologist Robert Cialdini's research on influence shows that symbols activate automatic compliance. We respond to the symbol before evaluating the request. Authority symbols, uniforms, titles trigger obedience regardless of actual authority. This is technique number 8 out of 10, the manipulation vulnerability point. For 80 consecutive days, identify every attempt to influence you through symbols rather than logic. Advertising, brand symbols, politics, flags, slogans, media, emotional imagery, social pressure, status symbols. Document what symbol is being used. What automatic response is it triggering? What would I decide if I ignored the symbol and evaluated logically? Track how often symbols determine your choices. Symbols activate emotional and identity systems that override rational evaluation. Marketers and propagandists exploit this by associating their message with symbols that trigger desired responses automatically. You're building awareness of symbolic manipulation so you can engage conscious choice rather than automatic reaction. Studies on propaganda effectiveness show that symbolic appeal works. Even when people recognize it's propaganda, the automatic response persists. Despite conscious awareness, start identifying symbolic manipulation and watch your choices become more conscious as you recognize when symbols are being used to bypass your reasoning. Part 9. The sacred symbol intensification. Certain symbols achieve sacred status. They become so emotionally charged that their desecration triggers disproportionate reactions. This reveals how deeply symbols integrate into neural identity structures. Anthropologist Emil Durkheim's work on sacred symbols shows they mark in-group boundaries. Defending the symbol defends the group. Neuroscience reveals why. Sacred symbols activate not just association networks, but identity and threat detection systems simultaneously. This is technique number 9 out of 10, the sacred symbol intensification. Identify which symbols you consider sacred ones, whose desecration would trigger strong emotional response. For 90 consecutive days, investigate this intensity. Why? Does this symbol feel sacred? What would happen to your identity if this symbol lost meaning? Can you imagine cultures or times where this symbol meant nothing? Notice the resistance to imagining your sacred symbols as arbitrary. Sacred symbols integrate so deeply into identity networks that they're defended as if they're part of self. Your brain processes sacred symbol threats as identity threats. You're recognizing that sacredness isn't inherent in the symbol. It's a measure of how deeply the symbol has embedded in your identity structure. Research shows that sacred value violations, flag burning, religious desecration activate brain regions associated with disgust and moral violation. The response is visceral, not cognitive. Start examining sacred symbol psychology and watch yourself recognize that sacredness measures neural integration depth, not symbols' inherent importance. Part 10. The symbolic fluency development. There's something that will blow your mind. You can train symbolic fluency, the ability to recognize, analyze, and consciously choose which symbols to allow to influence you rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. Psychologist Howard Gardner's work on multiple intelligences includes symbolic intelligence, the capacity to understand and manipulate symbolic systems. This isn't fixed, it's trainable through deliberate practice. This is technique number 10 out of 10, the symbolic fluency development. Implement comprehensive symbolic awareness training for 120 consecutive days, daily. Identify 5 symbols you encounter and analyze them. Using all previous techniques, what metaphor grounds them? What emotion do they trigger? What identity do they activate? What narrative do they reference? What are they compressing? Are they manipulating you? Rate your symbolic awareness 1 to 10 weekly. Track improvement over time as analysis becomes automatic. Symbolic fluency transforms symbols from unconscious triggers to conscious tools. You develop meet awareness, the capacity to observe your symbolic processing rather than being captured by it. You're training the prefrontal override of automatic symbolic responses, creating choice where only reaction existed. Studies on media literacy show that trained individuals resist symbolic manipulation more effectively. Awareness creates immunity. Start comprehensive symbolic fluency training and watch symbols lose their unconscious control as conscious recognition replaces automatic reaction. Closing these 10 mechanisms aren't just interesting observations, they're the complete map of how symbols literally shape your brain's structure, processing, and outputs. You're not a passive receiver of symbols. You're constantly encoding, processing, and being influenced by symbolic information that operates beneath conscious awareness. Conceptual metaphor foundation grounds abstraction in physicality, emotional contagion in coding, triggers automatic feelings. Identity construction matrix builds self from symbols. Compression algorithm function enables complex thinking. Pattern recognition hijack projects meaning onto neutral patterns. Cross-cultural translation barrier reveals learned convention. Narrative framework activation loads entire stories from single images. Manipulation vulnerability point exposes persuasion tactics. Sacred symbol intensification shows identity integration depth. Symbolic fluency development trains conscious mastery. Ancient wisdom traditions understood symbols' power empirically. Cave painters, religious iconographers, alchemists, and mystics all knew that certain images carry meaning beyond their physical form. They created symbolic systems, tarot, mandalas, religious art that encoded wisdom in visual form. Modern neuroscience explains the mechanisms they exploited. Symbols aren't mystical, they're how your brain encodes complex information efficiently. By exploiting pattern recognition, emotional association, and conceptual metaphor systems, your transformation doesn't start tomorrow or next week. It starts the moment you map your next conceptual metaphor. It starts when you catch the next emotional trigger from a symbol. It starts when you notice identity activation from a logo. The version of you with symbolic fluency isn't controlled by flags, brands,